This episode of the G4 Sumobot series will demonstrate the steps needed to create the Sumobot's main body using Blender 2.8 and above. This design can be printed using an FDM 3D printer, and it meets the design regulations of the Skills Canada Sumobot competition. According to the competition scope documents, the fully assembled Sumobot must not occupy a volume larger than 13 centimeters cubed, and it must sit flat on the bottom of this volume. These Sumobots must be controlled by handmade switches and must not weigh any more than 500 grams. Click on the link in the description below to learn more about the Skills Canada Sumobot competition. Start by opening Blender 2.8. If you're working on a computer other than the computers in the Harmony Lab, your version of Blender is going to look a little different. But don't worry, anything that we do here you can do in your own version of Blender, and if you're experienced you can even work in older versions of Blender and still do the same thing. Now, Blender's default units in 2.8 are meters. This cube that we're looking at right now is 2m in the X, Y, and Z direction, but if we were to print it out on our 3D printers in the Harmony Lab, we have Robo 3D R1 pluses. This would turn out to actually be 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters by 2 millimeters. So rather than change the units in Blenders, we'll just assume that we are working in millimeters and go for there. So because we are working to build a Sumobot that sits within a 13 centimeter cubed volume, that means that our maximum size in any direction on the X, Y, or Z axis can be 130 millimeters. So we're going to begin by creating a cube that fits into the space. We're going to go for 125 on the X-axis, 129 on the Y-axis, and 50 on the Z-axis. Now, as we're going along through this segment, any key presses that I make you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of my screen. And so if you're confused about how something was accomplished, just play back the video and watch the keystrokes. Now currently we are in perspective mode. You can see that at the top left-hand corner of the screen. I'm going to press 5 on the number pad and get into orthographic view. Now I'm going to press 3 on the number pad in order to get into my right view. So this is going to be the side of the Sumobot. And currently the Sumobot is sitting 25 millimeters above the X-axis and 25 millimeters below it. So we are going to go up to our location in the right-hand side, and we are going to type in 25, and we're going to bring this whole cube up above the X-axis. Now we want this cube to stay there, so we're going to press Control A on the keyboard, and we're going to choose location. This resets the cube's location to 0, 0, 0, but keeps the cube flat on the X-axis. The next thing that we need to do is we need to figure out a profile for the scoop on the front of our Sumobot. In a Sumobot competition, you want to push other Sumobots off the competition table, but if you have a flat pushing area, often you lose the advantage to another Sumobot that might have a curved scoop profile. So we're going to create one of those. So rotate so that you can press down the middle mouse button and rotate so that you see the front of your cube there. And then what you're going to do is you're going to left click on the front of the cube, and that's going to place the 3D cursor on the front of the cube. Press 3 on the number pad, and now we're going to add a cylinder. Now we can do that by going down to the add category, selecting mesh, and selecting a cylinder. This top bar, of course, has been moved to the bottom in our version of Blender. This is all something that you can customize in the preferences. So you just look through here and you can see different options for configuring Blender, and we've simply moved our top bar down to the bottom there. So header position is bottom. Yours is probably going to default to top like this. We are keeping ours at the bottom. Another way to add additional meshes to your scene is to press Shift and A and select mesh. We're going to select a cylinder, and in order to modify the size of the cylinder, we're going to go to the bottom left-hand corner here, and we're going to click on where it says Add Cylinder. We want to increase the number of vertices in the cylinder that we're working with. 32 vertices is going to create a very rough-looking cylinder, and this has the potential of, when we're using it to scoop up other Sumobots during the competition fight, other Sumobots might get caught on the ridges of our scoop. So we're going to increase our vertice count to 128. Now we want a fairly big cylinder to start with, so we're going to increase the radius to 50, and we need a depth of 140. We said earlier that everything is going to be a maximum of 130 millimeters, but we are not. This cylinder that we're creating is going to be used in a Boolean operation, so it will not be part of our final Sumobot design. Next, we're going to rotate the cylinder. We're going to rotate it 90 on the x-axis, 104 on the y-axis, and 90 again on the z-axis. So now we are looking straight on the end of the cylinder. We also want to make sure that this cylinder is centered with respect to the body of our Sumobot. So we are going to set the x coordinate position to 0, so that now centers the cylinder on the cube. And we are going to figure out where we want this cylinder here in just a minute. So we're going to click this little drop down arrow to make this box disappear. Now the scoop profile that we're looking at is the edge of the cylinder here, where the cylinder intersects with our cube. And right now that's not really a very useful scoop profile. So we're going to modify this cylinder so that it's more oblong, and we're also going to look at our scene in wireframe mode. You can get into wireframe mode by pressing Shift on your keyboard and Z. Press 3 on the number pad to get an edge-on view, and now we're going to modify how our cylinder looks. We're going to do that first by changing the dimensions of the cylinder. We're going to go up here, we're going to choose 120 for X, 84 for Y, and 140 for Z. For our location, we are going to move the location up to 45 on Z. Now, what we need to do is we need to remove as little of the cube as possible, and so we can do that by using the Translate tool. Now, by default, Blender 2.8 shows you the select box. Gizmo is what they're calling it now. So if you can't see the Translate tool or the Translate gizmo, so just click on Move here and you will get the arrows that will allow you to move your cylinder. We're going to zoom in here. And what we're interested in looking at is we want to create a fairly sharp edge on our scoop, because that's going to give us an advantage over other Sumobots that might have a more blunt edge. So we're just looking at the point here where the cylinder intersects with the box, and we are going to move this over a little bit. So let's try negative 86.5, and that gives us a nice easy number there to copy over to your own work. And even though we're cutting off a little bit of our tip, if we zoom back out, we can see that we're not really taking off much more of the front of our cube than we need to. So the orange glow on the cylinder means that the cylinder is the currently selected object in our scene. If we're going to do Boolean operations, we need to select the object that we want to keep. So we're interested in the final shape of this cube. So we're going to right click on the cube, and what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our modifiers panel on the right hand side of your screen. We're going to click on Add Modifier, and we're going to choose Boolean. Now, when you get more and more objects in your scene, it makes sense to have easy to identify names on your objects. So if we look to the top right hand corner here to our scene outliner, currently we've got a camera and a light in our scene which we don't need. We can right click on the line beside that and choose delete, and we can get rid of the light similarly by right clicking and choosing delete. Let's give our cube a more useful name. Let's double click on the word cube and let's write the word body. And let's double click on cylinder and let's call this one scoop. Now let's go back over to our Boolean operation, and in the object box, we have an empty box here. Click down, we can see scoop. Click on scoop and click apply. And you can see here that the front of our scoop, our body object, has already been modified by this Boolean operation, so we can keep it final by clicking on apply. Shift Z to go back into object mode, and we can see that our body now has, we can click on the cylinder and we can move the cylinder away. So we can see that our body has a proper scoop profile now. I'm going to hit Control Z to push the scoop back to where it needs to be. But if I'm in solid mode, I want to be able to have some color on my objects. It just makes it easier to work with them. So I'm going to right click on the Sumobot body, and then over here underneath the modifiers panel is the material panel. Click on that, and Blender by default has your preview panel open, and there's another one that's open. You can collapse the preview panel for the sake of what we're doing here. We're just interested in adding a little color to the object in the viewport. Click down on this white box here, and you can choose a color that makes you happy. The color doesn't really matter. We're going to do the same thing with the cylinder, so right click on the cylinder, click on new, click on the white box, give it a different color. So now these objects are a lot easier to see in the 3D viewport. We don't need to see the scoop object anymore. So we can either come up to the scene outliner and we can click on the picture of the eyeball beside the scoop to make it disappear, or if you want to be a little bit more efficient, when you have an object that is selected in the 3D viewport, you can simply press H on your keyboard and that will hide the object. So we're going to press 3 on the number pad to get back into our right hand view. Now that we've created a scoop on our Sumobot body, it's time to figure out where we're going to put the wheels for our Sumobot. So we're going to do that by creating a cylinder. Shift A to bring up our dialog for adding a mesh, and choose cylinder. Down here in the add cylinder modifier panel, we're going to keep the vertices at 128. The radius we're going to change slightly. We're going to change the radius to 27. The wheels that we're going to build later on are going to be 52 millimeters in diameter. So we're creating a fender that is 54 millimeters in diameter. So we're going to make sure that we give our wheels a little bit of clearance. We need to rotate the cylinder. So we're going to rotate it on the y-axis for 90 degrees. So that gives us an edge-on view. Now we are using the Tamiya gearbox 70168, and that particular gearbox has the central axle 11.5 millimeters from the bottom of the gearbox. So I have a model of the gearbox, and I'm going to bring that in now. It's in STL format, so I'm going to go, it's sitting on my desktop. It's file, import, STL, and on my desktop here is the 70168. Now I've helpfully positioned this gearbox where it's going to sit later. So I'm going to right click on the body, press H to hide it. So here is a version or a representation of the Tamiya gearbox that we're putting in these Sumobots. So the central axle that we're working with is going to be this axle hole here. And if we measure from the bottom of the gearbox to the middle of the axle hole, that is 11.5 millimeters. Now we are going to have a 3 millimeter plate that sits underneath our motor gearbox. So currently, if we were to look at where this gearbox is sitting, and the easiest way to do that is right click on the gearbox. I can go tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to select the face tool, and I'm just going to choose one of the random faces at the bottom here. We can see that it's currently sitting at 3 millimeters. So it is 3 millimeters above the x-axis. And I'm going to go tab to get back into object mode. So that means that our axle right now is 11.5 millimeters plus 3 millimeters. So our fender and the center of our wheel is going to be at 14.5 millimeters. So I'm going to come over here to the cylinder, and I'm going to put it at 14.5 millimeters above the x-axis so that it corresponds with our gearbox. If you're interested in working with your own copy of this gearbox, you can come over to the Harmony Lab, and the Harmony Lab help portal has a lot of the files that we are using through our different series. Up at the top here you can see Sumobot. We're working with the G4 Tethered Sumobot, so click down on that. And the dimensions that I'm providing in this tutorial can be found in the dimension sheet. So here is what the dimension sheet looks like. So you can follow along with the dimension sheet as you're watching the tutorial. And if you're interested in grabbing the Tamiya gearbox, it's currently stored on the GitHub account for Harmony Lab. So you can just click down on this link here and it will take you straight to a version of this gearbox. And you can just click on the download link and it will download to your computer. And then you can import it into Blender like you saw earlier by just using the file menu and going up to import STL. So right now we're going to hide the Tamiya gearbox, and I'm going to bring back the body. So now that I know where how high the wheel is going to sit above the x-axis, now I need to choose a position for my wheel. And currently my wheel is hiding inside my Sumobot because I don't have it centered on the x-axis. So I'm going to come up here to location and I'm going to center it there. And now what I want to do is in my side profile, I want to pick a good spot for it. Now I want to make sure that I leave enough plastic on the edge of the Sumobot so that if it gets dropped, it doesn't break. So something like that looks good. And I think I'm just going to make that a nice easy number, so 34.5. And that's a good place to leave that fender. I'm going to close that box there. Now before I cut this fender out of my Sumobot, I need to leave a little bit of material inside the Sumobot here for the motor mounting pedestal, because that 3 millimeter space that I mentioned earlier is a platform that the gearbox is going to be bolted to, but the plate itself needs to also be bolted back into the Sumobot body. So we're going to leave a little material here so that the motor plate can be bolted back to the Sumobot body. So right now we're going to right click on the Sumobot and hide it, H on the keyboard, and I am going to hit Shift C, and that centers the 3D cursor back at the origin. And now I'm going to add a cube. So Shift A, Mesh, Cube, and I'm going to change its dimensions here. I am going to give it dimensions of 70 on the X, 10 on the Y, and 50 on Z. I'm going to center this this cube with respect to this fender shape that I've created. So I'm also going to put it at 14.5. And now it's time to move this. So we want something that looks like this. And we're going to position it at, we'll just call that 58. Nice easy number. And we'll just make sure that this thing is centered on X and the cylinder is centered on X. And let's give these things names. So let's call this cylinder here our fender. And let's give this cube a name. Let's call it a pedestal cutaway. Okay, let's give them some colors. So under materials, I'll give this one some random pink color, and the fender can have a randomy orange color. Okay, so now we're going to do a Boolean operation. So we are going to select our fender cylinder because that's what we want to keep. And we're going to go over to the modifiers panel, add modifier, Boolean, and we are going to choose the pedestal cutaway, and we'll press apply. So we don't need this cube anymore. We can press H to hide it, and so we have cut a slot out of our fender cylinder now. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to bring our body cube back, and you can see now that when we do a Boolean cut, all this great big square part of the body will be left behind as well. So right click on our body, and we're going to go over to the modifiers panel, add modifier Boolean, and we're going to choose our fender and press apply. So we can hide the fender now. And so now our Sumobot our body is starting to take shape here. So this is where the wheels are going to go, and this is where the motor mounting plate is going to be connected. And we also have to make a space for the Tamiya gearbox inside of our body. And we also have a little bit of a problem here with the edges on the edge of our body here. These sharp points are going to try to cut into our wheels. We only left a small amount of clearance inside the fender wells, so we need to cut away these sharp points here in order to be able to slide our wheels in when it's time. So to do that, we're just going to create another cube. Shift A and select cube. And we're just going to move this thing out. Now we actually want this cube to be centered where our fender was sitting. So we need to figure out where the center of that fender was. So I can click the eyeball next to the fender to bring it back. Right click on the fender, and this white circle is the center of our cylinder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go Shift S, cursor to selected. And when I do that, the coordinates for that I'm interested in, which is the Y coordinate, and well, the X coordinate is going to be 0, but I'm really interested in the Y coordinate. That is over here. So on the right hand side, we can see a section for the 3D cursor, and so these are the coordinates of where the 3D cursor is sitting. And so the 3D cursor is sitting at 34.5. We could have also got that same information by right-clicking on the cylinder, and under our y-axis we've got 34.5. Now that we know the y location that we want our cube to be at, we can hide the cylinder. Let's go back to the cube that we created, and let's put in our y position, 34.5. And now we're going to modify the dimensions of this. So we're going to make it 130 millimeters in the X direction. We're going to make it 52 millimeters in the Y direction. And we're going to make it 10 millimeters in the Z direction. Now we're going to change the location here a little bit. Under the X position, we are going to change it to 3, and everything else looks fine. So if we look at this, we can see now that we are going to cut off a big chunk of the sharp point on the Sumobot body, and this will allow us to get the wheels inside the Sumobot body a lot easier. So let's give this a name. Double click on cube, and we're going to change it to the fender block cut. And right click on the Sumobot body. On the modifiers tab, we are going to choose Boolean, and there's our fender block cut. Press apply. Let's give it a color in case we need to bring it back later. So there's a yellow color for it, and H on our keyboard to make it disappear. So now we need to prepare the back of the Sumobot so that it will be useful for the motor mounting plate. So I'm just going to rotate it up so we can see the bottom of it. And the next thing that we're going to do here is we are going to modify the height of this part of the back of the Sumobot. So let's grab our face selection tool, let's grab this, and we can either go up to the left hand side here and click on the move gizmo, or you can press space to bring up the tools tab, and you can click down on move. So now we have our move arrows. We're going to bring it down to something like this, and what you need to make sure that you do is that you change the coordinate system that we're working into the global coordinate system. Right now, Blender defaults us to the local coordinate system. So click on global, and let's change this to 6.5. The last thing that we're going to do in this episode is we are going to create the space for where our gearbox is going to sit, so our motor cavity. So we are going to tab back into object mode. If you're wondering what that is, of course, down in the bottom left hand here corner is object mode. If you have an unmodified version of Blender, it'll be in the top left corner there. So we now have the 3D. We're going to put the 3D cursor at the origin there. So Shift C puts the origin at, or the 3D cursor at the origin. And let's create a cube. So Shift A and create a cube. Now the motor cavity dimensions are going to be 65 in the X direction, 60 in the Y direction, and it's going to be 43 in the Z direction. So how do we figure out where to put this thing? We need to make sure that we are cutting out enough space. We want the space to be deep enough to allow the gearbox to sit in it, but we don't want to cut away so much material that we weaken our Sumobot. So if we look at this, we're going to bring this close to the top here of the fender well that we've created, and it turns out that sort of the optimal location for this is about 3.5, and for our Z, if we set it to 19.4, that seems to be a really good position. So now that we have all of that prepared, we are going to give this a name. So double click on cube, and we're going to call it the motor cavity. And let's right click on our Sumobot body, and let's choose from the modifiers tab, Boolean, and let's find our motor cavity. Press apply, and we can now hide this object. So there we are. So we have created a spot for the gearbox to sit, and if we want to confirm that everything's sitting where it's supposed to be, here is the Tamiya gearbox model that I imported earlier. You can see we've got space at the front of the motor, and we've got space at the back of the motor. And this is going to be a little bit of a problem because our gearbox is going to be pivoted into this space, which means that the way our Sumobot is sitting right now, there's not enough clearance right here on the pedestal, and so the top of the gearbox is going to impact on this. So we're going to have to cut away part of this, but we'll do that in the next episode.